A very good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First and foremost, thank you very much, Datuk.
Hi, you're welcome. No problem.
Yeah, it is a privilege to all of us to have the executive director of Malaysia Employee Federation himself, Datuk Shamsuddin. Yeah, Datuk. So maybe I can give you the context, Datuk. Now, I think as you know, HR leadership circle, we are the largest social or informal group of CHRO and senior HR leaders. Yeah, Dato'. So we have more than 200. So during the recent discussion, there was an issue with regards to forced labor. And, not many fully aware what does it mean by forced labor. And for example, Dato', I share with them, you have your domestic assistant or your maid, yes. And then,
Yeah.
Do you hold their passports? They say, yes, that is forced labor.
Yep.
So I think with your experience and knowledge in this particular space, it is timely for us to understand what is forced labor. But because more often than not, when we share about forced labor, people have very limited knowledge what is forced labor entails. So with that, thank you for making time for all of us, and I would like to invite Datuk Shamsuddin to share his insight with regards to forced labor. Over to you, Datuk.
Terima kasih, Haji Farid. Terima kasih for the group for inviting me to share this particular issue. Yeah. And of course, when we talk about forced labor, actually it is a situation where someone is not able to leave the employment or being coerced, deceived to work for another person. So that is what they call it as forced labor. And of course, this constitute what we call it as serious violation of human rights and human freedom. Yeah. And of course, when we talk about forced labor, normally it is, of course, associated with the employment of foreign workers. Yeah. Even though forced labor can also happen in the employment of our local employees, but it is not really an issue, and no local employees actually had made any complaint that they are being forced to work under forced labor conditions. And so it is more when we actually started to engage foreign workers that this issue about forced labor arises. Yeah? And of course, in the ILO convention, we have Convention 105 to actually abolish forced labor in all the member states of ILO. And of course, this particular convention is basically trying to emphasize that as whatever is the background of the employee concerned, they shouldn't be actually mobilized to use this labor for purposes of economic development. So if at all you're engaged in any particular employment, occupation, thing like that, it must be based on voluntary basis. Yeah. And of course, what is also important is to say that each country, each member of the ILO must take effective measures to secure the complete and immediate abolition of forced labor, and of course there shouldn't be any kind of compulsory labor at all. Yeah. So in the Malaysian context, of course, initially there was some argument about whether when the inmates in prison are being trained by companies, by employers, before they are released to join the society, whether that amounts to forced labor. Yeah. So the ILO say that when you are being trained by the private sector employers and they are not actually being paid, that amounts to forced labor. But the government at that time, under the premiership of Tun Mahathir, said no. these people are being trained. We are preparing them for the labor market so that they can rejoin the society, and they are being facilitated to rejoin the society. And that should not be considered as forced labor. But the ILO insisted that in whatever way you try to explain, still, if you are not paying the inmates any wages at all, then that would amount to forced labor. And because of that, of course, the government the ratification of this particular convention on forced labor. So until now, Malaysia actually had actually withdrawn that ratification. But of course, still, as a member country of ILO, Malaysia is bound by the principles of this particular convention. So this is irrespective of whether the country ratify or you don't ratify this particular convention. And of course, if you're talking about this forced labor issue, yeah, because there is another convention which is Convention number 29 on forced labor itself. So talking about when you ask any person to work with the menace of penalty, and of course it is not on voluntary basis, that will amount also to what they call it as forced labor, and this happened at in any form of work or services, can cover anybody so long as there is a penalty and the labor is not given out of the free will. I had always raised this issue about freedom to choose the employer as far as the foreign worker is concerned. Yeah. And of course, I had raised this with MOHR. I had raised this with the Ministry of Home Affairs to say that in the Malaysian context, if you notice, the government actually approved the employment of foreign worker based on a specific industry. If you are meant for the plantation industry, then the PLKS will say that you are employed by in the plantation industry and also employed by a specific employer. So specific industry, specific employer. And in that context, this particular foreign worker will not be able to change the industry or change the employer within the same industry. And the international community had said that what is being practiced by Malaysia in respect of approving for specific industry and approving for a specific company is actually amounting to forced labor. Yeah, so this is where I even had suggested to the government that we should address this particular issue and possibly create a mechanism whereby the first employer will be compensated by the new employer of the foreign worker concerned on the amount of cost that he incur to bring in the foreign workers. Of course, that should be done on proportionate basis, and I hope the government will be taking up this matter so that we are no longer being classified as practicing forced labor as far as freedom to choose the employer is concerned. And these are actually the listed, I would say, criteria that actually being used by the international community, by the US, by the European Union, by even Canada, for example, to actually indicate whether there is forced labor or not. Yeah. And of course, when you're talking about the employees being in a vulnerable situation, and this is where, because of the fact that the person may not have any legal status in a particular country because they came in, say, for example, through unauthorized means, then, of course, this particular person will be in a more vulnerable state. And, of course, it is likely that they will be in condition of forced labor. Yeah? And of course, to the ILO, to the international community, the legal status of any person in a given country should not be the criteria to decide whether the law should apply to them or not, because to the international community, the labor laws will also apply even if the person concerned come into the country without any proper documentation, thing like that. And I believe the participants here could have well be aware of a recent case that was decided by the highest court in the country to say that even if the person concerned is of illegal status, that particular person would be able to enforce their rights as far as labor laws are concerned. And in this particular case, the employer actually didn't pay the wages to the employee concerned. And of course, a report was lodged at the Labor Department. Labor Department rejected that particular report because they say that you are illegal and you don't have any legal rights in Malaysia. Of course, that was contested by the person concerned and went up to the highest court, and the highest court say, no, the Labor Department was wrong. Labor Department should actually have heard the case without really looking at whether the person concerned is legal or illegal in the country. And of course, there are many situations where the employee concerned may be deceived in coming to Malaysia. We had a lot of cases of, say, for example, contract substitution. You know, many of the employees were actually promised jobs that are quite, I would say, something that they are looking for to work in Malaysia. But when they reach Malaysia, they are actually being asked to work in the plantation industry. Of course, they were very frustrated and say that they are being deceived into accepting employment in this particular industry because they thought that they are going to work in box making company or packing materials, things like that. So in that sense, they say that because of that, they wanted to be sent back, things like that. Of course, I know that there is a particular company that had been in that situation. It's a plantation company. And that plantation company, at the end of the day, have no choice but actually to send back the employees concerned. Yeah. And a restriction of movement is basically one of the things that can actually amount to forced labor. So say, for example, of course, in Malaysia, it's very common for us to have our hostel rules to say that you must come back before 10 p.m., you cannot go out before 5 a.m. And to the international community, it means forced labor because you are restricting the movement of the employee concerned. So again, I think these are some kind of things that normally we intended well by having that kind of rules, yeah, and requirement, but of course, the international community look at it differently. And if the person concerned is also being, placed in isolated places, deep into the villages, things like that, without any means of communication, then that also can amount to what we call it as forced labor. And of course, there is this physical and sexual violence thing that may happen. We had heard a lot of cases where the foreign worker is subjected to sexual violence, physical abuse. Yeah, the case of Normala Bonnet, for example, was a very, I would say, sad case where the maid was really physically abused by the employer, and of course the employer had to pay very expensively by being jailed, things like that. Yeah, so if there is this also intimidation and threats to the foreign worker concerned or to the worker concerned, that also can amount to forced labor. Excessive overtime, ladies and gentlemen, it also can amount to forced labor. Of course, Malaysia used to adopt 48 hours per week, but now we had reduced it to 45 hours per week, but our overtime remained the same, 104 hours overtime over a period of 1 year. Yeah, over a period of 1 month. But to the US, normal hours of work and overtime should not be more than 60 hours a day, a week. Yeah, but in a Malaysian context, if you're talking about a lot of overtime per day, per month, thing like that, it can amount to 70 hours, thing like that. So again, the national legislation allows us to do overtime over a certain period, but of course, we have to look into the requirements of the international community, especially the US, European Union, and Canada, for example, to make sure that our practices here would not be considered as forced labor because of the excessive overtime. Haji Farid just now talks about retention of identity documents. Yeah, of course, nowadays most employer would have complied with this requirement because they actually had surrendered the ID to the foreign workers concerned, and they got to keep their own documents. But of course, there are still some companies that assist to keep the document for their employees, but the condition is very strict to say that the employee will have 24 hours access to that particular ID. So it can be requested at a very short notice. But of course, normally employers keep the ID of the foreign worker concerned for safekeeping, not as a means to actually stop the employee from absconding. If the employee want to abscond, even without any proper passport, they will abscond anyway. Yeah, and of course, then they become illegal worker, thing like that. And of course, for safekeeping, I just happened to actually converse with one Bangladeshi that, he told me that he actually is ready to go back. His passport and his money, everything is kept in the bag in his room where he's sleeping. But when he woke up in the morning, everything, is no longer there. Passport, money, thing like that. And he said that he need to replace the passport. And I asked him, how much you need to pay to get your passport replaced? 8,000 ringgit, ladies and gentlemen. This is not a small sum for a foreign worker. And this is why sometimes you can understand that they request that the employer still keep the document. And in that sense, if we are able to ensure that, we keep the document with the consent of the employee concerned, and you have make arrangement to allow the employee concerned to have access to the document 24 hours, then that shouldn't be any problem. And of course, the other part is on the withholding of wages. Yeah, wages must be paid on a monthly basis. There's no such thing as you are keeping the money for the employee concerned, thing like that. That's why now all the wages payment under the Employment Act has to be made through financial institution. And of course, you need to also give the employee concerned their wages slip on monthly basis together with their signatures, thing like that. And of course, debt bondage. Again, this is an issue that I had raised with the international community to say that they shouldn't be accusing the host country like Malaysia to be practicing debt bondage. The debt bondage started, at the word go when the employee concerned wanted to come to Malaysia. They actually take loans from the financiers, from their leaders in the kampung, in a village, thing like that. And because of that, they incur a lot of debt. Yeah? And in that sense, of course, I actually had pointed out to the international community that they should educate the source countries to facilitate the movement of their employees to third countries like Malaysia, rather than trying to actually collect as much money as possible from the would-be foreign workers. And of course, the abusive living condition and also working condition, I think this more or less had been addressed when we actually had amended our Act 446 with very detailed provision and also stringent punishment. So I would say that abusive living condition is not a big issue anymore. But of course, there are sometimes certain issues like they are still being housed in congested containers, thing like that. Yeah. And of course, the other part is that when we talk about the issues of forced labor in Malaysia, this is basically, when you talk about the recruitment fees itself is very, very high. And that's why you see for a Bangladeshi that wanted to come to Malaysia, they have to pay something like 15,000 ringgit to the agents at the source country. And also the Malaysian employer has to pay something like 10,000 ringgit to their own agents. So for each Bangladeshi worker, you can pay as much as 25,000 per person. But of course, this issue about high recruitment fees is more or less like being resolved now, because most sending countries had enforced what they call it as zero-cost recruitment. So whatever money being incurred by the foreign worker concerned to come to Malaysia, the company that employed them in Malaysia has no choice but to make the necessary remediation of that particular cost. And of course, that we know that actually had costs. Sales, for example, Top Glove to pay more than 150 million ringgit just to resolve the issue of remediation of the cost incurred by the foreign worker when they come to Malaysia. Yeah. And of course, I would say that most of the issues now are being, of course, addressed by Malaysia. And of course, we know that some of our companies had even been hauled up by the U.S. authorities and Canada for actually breaching the forced labor requirements, and they had been slapped with what they call it as withhold release order, WRO. So any products that have been exported to the U.S. Before they are allowed to come into the market, of course, the Custom and Border authorities of U.S. has the power to inspect those particular products and decide whether it is being made by people who are involved in forced labor. And of course, these are some of the factors that lead to actually forced labor in Malaysia. Sometimes you, as the employer, may not be fully aware of what is happening. You depends very much on your agents, to bring in the foreign labor. And of course, unknowingly, you may be actually practicing forced labor itself. Yeah? And of course, when you talk about forced labor, ladies and gentlemen, in our constitution itself, of course, we have Article 6 of the constitution that talks about prohibition of slavery and all forms of child labor or forced labor. And also, of course, we know that the provisions of Penal Code, Section 359 to Section 375, talks about the kind of criminal charges that can be imposed on people who are involved in forced labor. Yeah? And this is just actually for our just knowledge about the provisions of the Article 6 of our federal constitution. Yeah, and of course, this actually, if you talk about the federal constitution, is the highest law in the country. Yeah, so of course it is prohibiting forced labor or slavery. Yeah, and of course, you know that under the Employment Act, the new amendments. Yeah. Of course, there is this provision on child labor. It is quite weak, yeah. But of course, if you look at the penalty on conviction, it is something like 100,000 ringgit or imprisonment of 2 years or both. Yeah? And of course, that by standard of the Employment Act, it is higher than the normal penalty of 50,000 and without imprisonment, thing like that. Yeah, and of course, Malaysia also have this ETIPSOM. Yeah, we're talking about law that prohibit human trafficking and smuggling of people, and of course, the punishment is 20 years. Yeah. And of course, the penalty also can include a fine of up to 1,000 ringgit for offences committed by the company as far as ETIPSOM is concerned. And also important, ladies and gentlemen, you look at the last bullet point there, who can be actually be taken to task as far as ETIPSOM is concerned: company director, manager, or any officer who is responsible for management of a company. Yeah, and of course, here they can say that they can be held liable for the offences committed by the company. So again, I think we need to be careful and make sure that whatever practices that we have in your company is in compliance with all these laws, anti-trafficking laws, and also the Employment Act, Immigration Act, Constitution, thing like that. Yeah, and what is important, ladies and gentlemen, we may think that we had complied with everything as a company. I can agree with you. Most of the big companies would have put in place all their procedures, all their rules and regulation to make sure that you are not practicing forced labor. But please remember that when you talk about forced labor, you're talking about not just your company, but also within your supply chain. And that is critical. Yeah. So if any of your supplier is involved in forced labor, you as the main company, you as the principal company will also be held liable for forced labor practices. Yeah, that's why you see complying with all this requirement can be very critical. Yeah, and of course, I would really suggest that your company, you have any suppliers, any contractors, thing like that. Yeah, especially your contractors, subcontractors. You should make it a habit to actually look at their books before you make your next payment to them, because then what are the kind of things that you need to look for when you check their books? Question is whether they are complying with all the labor laws, whether they actually had paid the EPF, the SOCSO, EIS, thing like that, and also the KWSP. Yeah, because say for example, in the SOCSO law, if you as the principal employer actually is not careful, and one of your contractors actually not paying any SOCSO to their worker, then you as a principal employer can be liable to make good the late penalty pay charges, and also the contribution itself. So the amount can be huge. Last time you can always negotiate with SOCSO to waive the late penalty charges, but it's not possible under the current situation, under the current circumstances. So I would suggest, I would urge you to for companies that have suppliers, subcontractors, things like that, to look into their books to ensure that they comply with all the labor legislation, especially on the issues of forced labor. Yeah. And of course, these are some of the positive aspects that you as a company need to look at, why you should be interested in actually making sure that your company is not involved in any forced labor practices. Yeah. And of course, these are part of the things I had mentioned earlier. The custom and border protection of the US had actually imposed various WROs against Malaysian companies. At least there are currently there are about 6 companies that had been involved in WRO. Yeah, this far, Sime Darby and Top Glove were able to actually lift that WRO thing. And of course, there are some companies that are still struggling to actually lift that WRO. Yeah. And of course, this is just the Top Glove issue. And of course, I had mentioned to you about the supply chain, and also the fact that, of course, as far as the CPTPP is concerned, I'm sure you all are aware of the fact that Malaysia had signed the CPTPP, and after a long lapse, actually had in May decided to ratify the CPTPP. And the CPTPP contains what they call it as the labor chapter clause, yeah, where it talks about issues on forced labor, thing like that. And of course, these are the social clauses that are being incorporated into the CPTPP. And of course, of late, the government has been very active in negotiating and also trying to be part of the what they call it as Indo-Pacific economic framework. This Indo-Pacific economic framework, IPEF, is something very new. Previously, the government was more like hushing the issue, not wanting to discuss the matter openly. But recently, MEF got called to the meetings on this IPEF by the at least by the international division of the Ministry of Human Resources, and I had given my views about the IPEF as far as employees issues are concerned. And of course, one of the things within the pillar of the IPEF, they have 4 pillars. One of the pillars is supply chain. And within the supply chain, the US tried to impose a condition to all the member states, 14 member states of IPEF, to say that they should ban any importation of product from any country involved in forced labor and child labor. But of course, I raised with the government to say that we need to be very careful in that. We need to put asterisk in that particular requirement, because we know that we import a lot from China for our raw materials. Yeah? And of course, the danger will be if we just accept that particular requirement. Of course, we know that China is not very good in their child labor or forced labor and human rights implementation, and we may have a lot of problem if we do accept that particular requirement by the US. So these are some of the issues that are coming of late. And as far as IPEF is concerned, it involved 14 countries, including the USA, including China, Indonesia, and Thailand. And if you note that the CPTPP doesn't include Indonesia, doesn't include China, doesn't include, India, Thailand, and the US. So these are some of the issues that are coming of late. And of course, you're talking about the supply chain issue just now. I think we need to be very careful on this, because unknowingly, you may be caught in a situation of forced labor because one of your suppliers actually is involved in forced labor. Yeah, and of course, nowadays, producers or service providers, you need to actually to meet your buyer's expectation. Yeah, and of course, this is important, because if your buyers not happy with what you are doing as a company, you're indulging in forced labor, child labor like that, and of course they also can actually end their contract. And of course, nowadays many companies now turn to what they call it as the ESG elements in trying to maintain their sustainability. Yeah, and of course, these are part of the things I had mentioned earlier, to say that nowadays, if you talk about trade agreements, starting from the failed, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, when US withdrew from the agreement itself. Yeah, and then of course we have the CPTPP. Now we have the IPEF, and also the agreement that we are negotiating with the European Union. All talk about this issue on social clauses. Yeah? And of course, as far as Malaysia is concerned, we also have to deal with the TIP report. Yeah, and of course, Alhamdulillah, in a recent announcement by the US, we are updated to the second tier watch list. We had been in the third tier of the US TIP report for 2 consecutive years, 2020, 2021. And of course, when you are in third tier, you're listed alongside companies like Burkina Faso and all the lesser developed countries, things like that. Yeah, and of course, as far as the TIP report is concerned, I know that the government is taking serious steps to ensure that we will no longer be downgraded to the third tier, thing like that. Yeah, and of course, these are some other points that I think we need to actually take into consideration when we talk about trying to be in the good books of the international community. And I had talked about the zero-cost recruitment, which is costing a lot of money to the Malaysian employers. But of course, we are encouraged by the statement of the Yang Amat Berhormat Prime Minister, to say that the way we recruit foreign workers, the way we actually calculate our costing has to be reviewed. Yeah, and of course, the government actually endeavored to actually remove the participation of agents in the process of employing foreign workers, and we should actually all do it online. Yeah, and of course, these are some of the guidelines, some of the certification standard that we as employers need to know. Yeah, I just list it there for you to go deeper into it. And also, these are some of the other initiative by the international community as far as issues of forced labor are concerned. Yeah, and as MEF, ladies and gentlemen, we had been working closely with ILO in trying to come up with guidelines to prevent forced labor. And we had actually published a book called A Handbook for Employers and Businesses in Combating Forced Labor. This book is available online. Please just go to our website. You can download it for free, thing like that, and you can actually read the full details of our work on trying to assist employers to prevent forced labor. Yeah, and of course, currently we are also embarking on another project with ILO. This is talking about trying to eliminate sexual harassment, violence, and also trying to prevent discrimination at the workplace, and of course also actually handling what you call it as sexual harassment at the workplace. And this document now is being finalized, and hopefully by next month we are going to go around the country and trying to actually raise awareness of the employers on all this subject. Yeah? And of course, these are the kind of things that we had done around the country to actually talks about trying to eliminate forced labor, thing like that. Yeah? And we are very much part of what we call it as the ILO Global Business Network on Forced Labor. And we are proud to say that we are the first employers organization in the world to join this network on forced labor. This is part of the ILO community. And of course, we are also part of ASEAN, and ASEAN Confederation of Employers also actually made a lot of work to actually eliminate forced labor practices. Yeah? And of course, as employers, as individual employers, I would encourage all the participants here to actually understand further what is forced labor, and perhaps take more serious action as far as your supply chain is concerned. Yeah, of course, some of you may be actually being bound by your good conduct of bias code of conduct or sourcing policy. And of course, you need to actually comply with those kind of thing. Otherwise, then you may have issues with their implementation. And of course, there are some of the policies, some of the implementation part that you may want to actually get involved with. You have your compliance audit, you have your recruitment and employment practices, and incorporate issues of forced labor, your staff training, and when you communicate with your stakeholders. And of course, like I say, ladies and gentlemen, when you talk about all these things, it includes your suppliers and also subcontractors. Yeah? And of course, then as part of the recommendation that we made in our toolkit, we actually had recommended that employers do develop what they call it as the grievance procedure that contain all the elements I had mentioned there. And of course, you need to actually maintain, you need to monitor the issues of forced labor. And if need be, you need to take up the corrective action. Yeah. And of course, what is important is basically, ladies and gentlemen, you may not be able to actually work on your own on this issue, and do connect with MEF, because MEF is in a position to assist you together with our collaboration with ILO and international expert on the subject matter. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving me the space. Yeah. And thank you very much for actually inviting me to this particular session.
Thank you, Datuk. Datuk